LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains graphic descriptions of men's violence against women. Please listen with care. Welcome to Crime Insiders Forensics. For those joining us for the first time, my name's Kathryn Fox. I'm a former GP, crime author and screenwriter. I'm enthralled by forensics and have spent thousands of hours researching for books and screenplays. So I thought, why not turn my research into a podcast? Every week, you'll be joining me in discovering how forensic science is helping solve high-profile crimes in Australia and around the world. When Marlene Maria Smith didn't turn up to work in August of 2000, the police knew something wasn't right. The only evidence they had was a face washer with a stain that looked suspiciously like blood. At the time, Peter Baines was a crime scene investigator with the New South Wales Police. As you'll hear, his thorough forensic examination would uncover the only evidence pinning the perpetrator to the crime.
So I went into the scene, and as a forensic investigator, you start looking, and the question is, what are you looking for? So, well, I don't know, but I'll know when I find it.
To begin, Peter shares how he went from general duties policing to being one of the state's busiest crime scene investigators.
I'd never gone through school or anything with a desire to join the police, but I received enough marks to go to Wollongong University and study a Bachelor of Arts. Rolled up to Wollongong University and very quickly realised that I had no clear direction or reason for being there, nor for studying a Bachelor of Arts. And so as quick as I arrived, I left. And saw some uniformed police walking through Parramatta where I was working part-time and thought, that could be interesting. Applied and joined, and by the age of 19, I was down at Goulburn. My first placement was to Marylands Police Station, which is a very different place to what it is now. And we could go the entire night shift without the phone ringing. We would drive around looking for something to do to keep you awake. It was such a quiet place. And after 12 months of that, I thought there's got to be more. And I applied for a transfer to Cabramatta. And everyone was happy to facilitate that based upon no one wanted to go to Cabramatta. It had the highest murder rate in Australia at the time. There was the warring gangs between the 5T and the banana gangs, who were all involved in the heroin trade, which was sweeping through that area at the time. And I worked there for 4.5 years, and I honestly got sick of dealing with domestics and drunks. And the police station at Cabramatta backed onto the Cabravale Diggers Club, and every Friday night, Saturday morning, the club would empty, and it felt like half of them would come to the police station looking to call taxis, looking to order pizzas, looking to complain, looking to use the toilets, and of course they were all full of alcohol and bad manners. And I just thought there's got to be something more, and there was an advertisement within our internal police magazine for the Forensic Services Group. And I applied and joined the crime scene section because I'd always found the investigation of death interesting. So applied and won a job in at the crime scene unit at the Sydney Police Centre at Surrey Hills, and that was where I started.
So what was your first case when you were working in forensics? Can you remember it?
Certainly the first job I remember, not necessarily the first one I attended, was a stabbing homicide. We were working 3 shifts at the time, and it was the afternoon was a Friday, and there'd been whatever led to it. He had fatally stabbed his wife on the steps of a building near Chinatown, and his wife, as was discovered during the post-mortem, was pregnant. And do you know what? I can't drive past that location and not for a few seconds think about that job and think about her.
I think that's something we sort of tend to forget as well, that there are triggers, because if you've been to a scene like that and had to work at that scene, you still have to go past that because that's your local area.
Yeah, absolutely. Only yesterday I returned from speaking at a conference in Tamworth, and Tamworth was where I'd spent 10 years of my forensic career, and there is so many places up there and towns and that have, memories of the jobs and the times and what we did and the significance of some of those. And, at the time of investigating and responding to some of those major crimes, there's a very clear focus on your job, which is to attend, examine, record, interpret, and present the evidence. Yeah, and I think it's, Kathy, as you get older and you're well removed from that, I probably think more of the significance of those jobs and the impact it had on families. And there was a particular job I did in Tamworth, which, really brought that home to me because it was the victim of a fatal farming accident was very close to our family. And, for me, it helped me realise that not everyone is dealing with death on a weekly basis as we were. And you lose the perspective and sometimes you forget the significance and the enormity of what we're involved in.
And I think the other things people underestimate is first responders and doctors, police, know people in those rural areas in which they're living and working.
That was exact circumstances. I arrived at a fatal farming accident and the ambos had covered the body with a sheet. And, of course, that was irrelevant to what had happened. So I removed the sheet and laying on the ground was the husband of my wife's best friend. My kids and his kids all played together. And to see Laurie laying on the ground was, I reeled back and ended up taking custody with the coroner's permission of the entire investigation. So I did the interviews with the family and so forth so that they didn't have to deal with people they didn't know. But it was a job that helped me remember the families behind the jobs because, as I say, I did so many of them that you in some sad way, you would forget the significance of that. And that job with Laurie helped me remember that broader and lasting impact.
The emotional toll and responsibility placed on you must be so much greater when you are close to people and their families.
Yeah, I think you would know, having spoken to many people from within this area and having been a medical practitioner yourself, you see the impact of exposure and PTSD and part of the role that I was doing towards the end of my career was dealing with those internally who left the organisation with PTSD, and it was always a question without an answer as to why those of us who went through what we might say is relatively unscathed, why we came out okay and why others did not. I don't know that there's a clear answer, and I feel fortunate that I had the career that I did and had the diversity of the work that I did, and feel in the main that I came out the other side okay. And I think one of the things for me was that I was fortunate through a number of reasons that my role within the forensic services continued to change as I moved through the organisation. So never did I look forward and go, oh, well, I'm on call for another 10 or 15 years. Realistically, as I said, I just returned from Tamworth. I left there in 2002. It's feasible I could still be up there working as a crime scene investigator 20 years after I left, still been on call. I grew tired of the travel and the jobs and so forth when I was there, and I was fortunate to move back to Sydney into a new role, which then removed me and changed the perspective and changed the role and changed the nature of the work.
Well, I think one of the things is doctors have this as well, and particularly specialists who are on call all the time for their private patients, never going to sleep, knowing you're going to get a full night's sleep of peace. And you know that if you are called, it's something catastrophic.
What I grew tired of was not the catastrophic jobs. In some strange way, I really enjoyed the contribution and the challenge of the big jobs. It was getting called to jobs in some of those country areas where you were despised as much by the victim as you were by the offenders. And you'd walk into a house and there was fingerprint dust on the house from the last time it was a crime scene. It was those jobs where I went, I'm adding absolutely zero value, but I have to be here. I know how this will play out before the courts. And it was those jobs. It wasn't the big jobs. It was those ones. But you're absolutely right. That disturbance to your sleep is not healthy.
Where were you in your career when you looked at a particular case in Tenterfield? And just for those, because we have people who listen from overseas, where is Tenterfield?
So Tenterfield is as far north in New South Wales as you can get before you cross over into the New South Wales-Queensland border. And it's probably about 2-3 hours drive west of the coast. So it's in that very far northeast before we cross over and head across to Byron Bay, which most people would recognise. So I was working at Tamworth in the time, and it was towards the end of my time in Tamworth. So I left there in 2002 to return to Sydney, and the particular job was in the August of 2000. And I received a call to travel up and investigate a scene. And the interesting thing about the job was I was called early evening, and the police who called me said, we've got a missing person here. Marlene Pryor is her name. She didn't turn up for work. And we have her estranged husband who came to the police station to assist with inquiries. He left to go and get lunch and never returned. They said, can you come to the scene and examine? And I said, well, what's the scene? And they said, well, the house. I said, well, I can't drive up just because you've got a missing person. There has to be something more than that. And then a number of hours later, they called me back and said, okay, we've been into the house and we found what we believe to be a blood-stained face washer. Will you come now? And I said, okay. And so I finished up, packed my kit bag and drove for 3 hours to arrive in the dead of night, in a freezing cold night, into this small house in Tenterfield. So I arrived at the job and was briefed by the detectives, Steve Clark, who was there at the time, and there was uniformed police who were guarding the scene. And the briefing was not much more than what I'd been given hours earlier. The only updated information they gave me was that the car that had been driven to Tenterfield Police Station by the estranged husband had been left there. So when he drove to the police station to assist with inquiries, he parked at the back of the police station, went inside, and because he wasn't under arrest, he wasn't formally detained. When he said, I want to go and get lunch, they had no reason or no power to hold him at the stage. He walked out the front door, then hitchhiked his way back to Lismore, which is where he'd come from, which is back on the coast near Ballina and Byron Bay, some 3 hours away, and left his vehicle there. So that was all the information that we had, other than Marlene hadn't been cited. There'd been no further information about her whereabouts. So I went into the scene, and as a forensic investigator, you start looking, and the question is, what are you looking for? You say, well, I don't know, but I'll know when I find it. And it was a very modest timber house. It had a caravan out the back, and where the estranged husband would come over and stay so he could visit the children from the marriage. And I went into the house, and nothing appeared out of the ordinary. And the bloodstained washer that they spoke about was located on the bed in the main bedroom. And it certainly looked as though the washer hadn't been used to just wipe up a spill of blood, because it was clear that the washer had been wrung out in water because it was stained, as opposed to holding clear blood from a cleanup. So that was the information that had been presented with, and there are a number of things that stood out as unusual, in that Marlene's handbag and purse was on the bed. The bed was covered, but there were no sheets on the bed, and that appeared unusual. My practice at attending a job like that would be to spend some time just walking through the scene and looking to get a feel for the job and get a feel for the scene and, what was out of place and just to feel immersed in the scene. And as I walked through the house, I found a second blood-stained washer, which was sitting on a cast iron slow combustion fire, which was in the other end of the house. And the presence of one might explain a nosebleed. The presence of two raised concerns. And the fact that the house, it was winter, it was freezing cold, and this sat on top of the fire, which was the source of heating for the house, indicated to me that the fire hadn't been lit since this washer had been placed there. So I go, okay, well, there's something unusual here. And I returned to the bedroom and just spent more time, again, looking and examining what was present. And what I first identified that caused alarm was some blood spots that were on the bed head and were on the bedside chest of drawers and the clock radio that were there. And it was clear from the impact angle of the blood spots that showed the direction in which they'd come from. They were low velocity, and so for me, it was I didn't feel as though a firearm had been used, but it was clear that there was a blood spatter within the room, indicating had been a level of violence inflicted on someone. And at that point, I contacted the detectives and let them know what I'd found, and the concerns were probably heightened and confirmed that something untoward, something sinister had happened to Marlene. And finding those, then I obviously became increasingly and more interested and focused on that room. And it had very high ceilings, and what I found on the ceiling was further blood spots, and then on the opposite wall as well. So it appeared to me that they were consistent with cast-off blood spatter, but what was missing from the wall above the bed was the presence of blood. So we had minute traces of blood on the bed head and on the bedside table, on the roof, and on an opposing wall, but not on the wall above the bed head, which obviously led me to believe that the presence of the washers and the blood staining on them had been used to clean the scene.
Can you just explain what cast-off is?
Yeah, so if we've got, in this case, what I presented to the court, it was my opinion that Marlene was laying in bed. And if we stand at the foot of the bed and look towards the head, it's my opinion that she was laying on the right side of the bed, and her head was where you'd expect a pillow to be. And it was the evidence that I'd present to the court that, in my opinion, the offender has struck her multiple times with an instrument whilst she's been in bed, possibly asleep at that first time. And if you think about someone who is in that circumstance, if they're hit once with an instrument, that there's no blood, and because the blood comes from the wound. But as you repeatedly strike that person, the weapon that you're using will be covered in blood. And then as you pull that weapon back above your head to bring it down to strike another blow, there's blood that's on the weapon, which is then cast off that weapon and will be transferred throughout the scene. And that's what we were finding, was that what I would do over the subsequent days would do a blood splash reconstruction, which involved the measurement of the length and width of each of these blood spots. Then using trigonometry, we could determine the angle of impact of that particular blood spot. And as I said, this was a ceiling that was probably 10 foot high and required us with ladders to be measuring and recording these minute blood spots on the roof and walls. And then from there, we could attach a string line at the angle of impact, and that string line continues to a fixed point wherever that might be. And then what you find as you get a number of these string lines coming together, there's a point of convergence, which allows you to form an opinion as to the point of origin of those blood spots.
So she wasn't moving around while being assaulted?
From the blood splash, there was nothing to indicate that that had occurred. But in saying that, it was clear that the scene had been cleaned and it had been put back together to appear as though everything was normal, where the bed had been stripped of the blood-stained bedclothes and a new dinner had been put down and the bed had been made, but with the absence of sheets, which was one of the things, as I said, that stood out to me as unusual when I first entered the room.
From the cast-off stains that you did find, could you therefore identify a minimum number of blows that were inflicted?
Potentially someone who has a lot more experience in blood splash analysis may have been able to do that. All I could say was that there was multiple. And what I think did occur, and I can't determine the order in which it occurred, but it would appear from the cast-off that was present that he changed his positions at least twice, where once he was standing parallel to the side of the bed and striking her, and then perpendicular to the bed, which would have given the cast-off on the opposing wall. We could certainly in my opinion, determine that there was repeated blows to the head, and it had occurred over a not insignificant period of time, given the distribution of blood that remained even after he'd cleaned it up.
How do you therefore assess the blood that has been cleaned up?
Yeah, so after we had done all the blood splash reconstruction and the sampling we did obviously presumptive testing at the scene to give us an indication that what was there was likely to be blood. But of course, the confirmation of that is the confirmatory testing is performed within the laboratory. So after the sampling had been done, the recording, the string line and so forth, then what I did was use two chemical agents as both a searching and as a tool to reveal what might have occurred. And the first was I used luminol within the bathroom of the house. And luminol reacts to the heme within the blood, within the hemoglobin. And luminol is a searching tool. So we require complete darkness, and it's an agent which is mixed and then put in a spray bottle. And it's sprayed on the scene, and you'll get a chemiluminescence that will appear as an indication that blood may be present. When you get the chemiluminescence, you need to be ready with your camera and record it, because it will fade and it doesn't last long. So you need to do the best you can to record it so you can present that evidence to court, because it fades very quickly. So I did that in the bathroom and found the positive response to the possible presence of blood within the bathroom, and based upon the location of the bathroom and the blood-soaked washes that I'd found, it made sense that there'd been a clean-up of the scene and that had been done within the bathroom. Then on the wall of the bedroom, I used leucocrystal violet. Now, leucocrystal violet is a permanent stain, and you don't use it as a searching tool, but you use it when there's intelligence to suggest that there's blood there. Again, it's something that's prepared on site and sprayed onto the walls. You don't need darkness for leucocrystal violet. What was revealed by the presence of the LCV was these very clear marks on the wall, which were an indication of a wet cloth with, these sideways marks where someone's cleaned something up. So if we think about using a dirty cloth to clean a window, for example, you'll have all of the marks that are left from the attempted cleanup. And this was what I was finding with the presence of the LCV. And that was why there was no obvious blood on the wall above the bedhead, because he'd cleaned it up. And that was what was revealed with LCV.
So whoever cleaned it up was obviously acting very quickly because they missed the clock radio and the others and the ceilings and things.
Yeah, and they're obviously operating under a distress and stress and anxiety and all the rest, and a time pressure to get the job done. But I've got to say, the uniform of the detectives who attended the scene at my request to find something that would warrant my travel from Tamworth to Tenterfield, they hadn't found any of this. So the offender in the cleaning up had done a good job. And it was only that I was there without the pressure of time, without the anxiety and the stress that he was under in cleaning. And I had deep suspicions of what had occurred, that I found it. And it wasn't completely obvious. So he did a good job in cleaning up. And that would be reflected in the gravesite when we'd eventually find the body.
Was the house closed off from the moment she went missing, or were children still traipsing in and out?
There was a child there at the time of the homicide. There was no evidence presented by the child at court that they had knowledge of the offence that had occurred. And I'd like to think that they slept through what was the homicide of their mum.
How long were you actually in that house for?
Yes, I got called up there, and I think it was dinner time, if I recall, when I left Tamworth. So, it's putting an arrival time of somewhere between probably 9 and 10 o'clock that I got to the scene at night. And I worked through the night knowing that this was never a job or never a scene that was going to be completed that night. And I booked into a motel that evening or early hours of the morning and had a couple of hours sleep. But I would spend a number of days and nights in Tenterfield, and all of that blood reconstruction was done in the days subsequent with the string lines. And once we took possession, or once I arrived at the scene was guarded 24 hours by uniform police. So when I wasn't there, if I was at the police station or, examining the vehicle or indeed sleeping in the hotel, the uniform police kept custody of the house. So it was probably 3 or 4 days that we held possession of the house before it was released.
That must be completely exhausting for you, because all the burden is on you to get this right. So how were you feeling? Were you feeling isolated professionally, or were you feeling part of a team?
I was in the police for 22 years and forensic services for 18 years or so forth. And this job remains for me, and I used to lecture at University of Western Sydney on this job, because of the significance and the total and utter reliance upon the forensic evidence. We had, at that time in this story, we had no victim. We had a suspect, but no known offender. There were no witnesses. There was no electronic evidence. There was nothing. So everything that the detectives were working on and relying on was coming from my examination of the scene. We had fingerprints attend the scene, but that was more of an elimination, because finding the ex-husband's fingerprints in the house, unless they were in blood, really meant nothing, because he had legitimate reason and past reason to be there. So how was I feeling? It was, these were the type of jobs, and in no way do I take away from the tragedy experienced by the family and by Marlene and by the children who survived her. But these were the jobs that we went to university for, and the reason for existence, because it was the responsibility on the potential successful prosecution of the offender rested on my shoulders. And this was probably the time of most second guessing and uncertainty in all that I did was when you left the scene and handed it over. When you said, I'm finished, and the police would then close the door and hand the keys to someone else, and you had effectively given up that scene, because going back after that was always problematic, because it then showed that you'd missed things. And so that was always one of the most difficult times in a job like this, where it was so forensic evidence based, was to say, I've done everything I can here, and I'm handing the scene back. But there obviously comes a point in time when you have to do that.
I think what people don't understand is the intensity of your work. How do you deal with the intensity of that exhausting emotional and intellectual energy being used up?
The hardest time is at around that 4 o'clock in the morning, where you think, I need to get some sleep. You put your head on the pillow, and then all your head does is think about what you need to do, the lines of inquiry, what might have happened, what you could do better, what you can do differently, what you're going to do when you wake up, which was, in 2 or 3 hours' time. And you got back up and returned to the scene. And again, it's a time that for me was always something that I felt I thrived on, because I understood the significance. And that was why I was in the job. That was why I did what I did, for these big jobs where you made a difference. And that was what was so meaningful.
After you've done your work inside the house, where were you asked to next investigate?
The next part of this job, which was, it's such a fascinating job. I love talking about this particular job because it just represents so much about the good of forensic science. And we had his vehicle, which had been left at the police station, because still at this time there's no body, there's no witnesses. The person of interest, Raymond Pryor, has not been seen or heard of since the day he walked out of the police station, but his vehicle was there. And I went and examined the vehicle, and it was one of those vehicles where it was hard to see the floor in the footwell because there was just so much rubbish. Every McDonald's wrapper that he'd ever taken off his hamburger was on the floor, and the car was just full of rubbish, which made it difficult, because then you never knew what might be relevant or what not. Like if it was a very clean and empty car, things that you'd find there was easy to say whether this could potentially be related. So I spent several hours, if not a full day, then examining the vehicle and pulling everything out of it and recording it and going, is this potentially an exhibit or not? Because I still don't have a body, still don't have an offender. All we've got is the blood-stained house. But there are a number of things I found in the vehicle which would later prove to be related. There was a roll of duct tape, there were cable ties, there were a pair of King G work trousers, and some other items. And at the time, didn't know the relevance of any of it, but collected it all and took bags and bags of exhibits back to Tamworth Police Station so I could examine them within our facility at the crime scene unit. And examining the vehicle, what I found on the outside were what appeared to be some blood spots on the door and the handles and so forth. And they were small, but swabbed them. They reacted to, as a presumptive test, positive for blood. So they were sampled and they would be submitted for analysis and for DNA. So at this point, when I finished the vehicle, I've already handed back the scene. I finished the examination of the vehicle, collect what I think is relevant. It's all bagged, it's all in brown paper bags, and I'm heading back to Tamworth Police Station. Full briefing's been passed on to the detectives, and I return and I start examining the exhibits back at Tamworth Police Station, and the first thing I turn my attention to is the blue trousers, King G trousers. And what I find on the knees of both trousers is what appears to be very fresh mud patches where someone's been kneeling in wet mud. So that's interesting. Then I turn the pockets inside out and find what appears to be and would subsequently prove to be blood on the inside of the pockets. So clearly the person that's been wearing these pants at some time has had wet blood on their hands and they put their hands in their pockets. So that's obviously sampled and again submitted for analysis. So now we have blood from the house, we have blood from the outside of the vehicle, and we have blood from the trousers, which is all sent for analysis. And we're able to take a sample of the trousers from around the hem, which is a good place for indicating the DNA of the person that's been wearing the trousers. So what we're looking to confirm is that the blood we believe to be that of Marlene Pryor, and if we can get the DNA from the pants to show that they've typically been worn by the alleged offender, Raymond Pryor, we're starting to build some evidence towards his involvement in the homicide. So whilst all this is going on, by the very nature of working in a rural crime scene unit, Greg Carnell and myself, who my work colleague, are then called out to a murder-suicide in a town of Atunga outside of Tamworth. So I leave everything to do with this job and head out to assist Greg at the murder-suicide. And whilst I'm at the murder-suicide, I then receive a call from police radio to contact them by phone. I contact police radio by phone and they advise me that Raymond Pryor has turned up at LiSTNR Police Station with his solicitor, and he provides to the police a pre-prepared statement that in part says, I have knowledge of the location of Marlene Pryor. And in the paragraph that follows that, he details where the body of Marlene Pryor may be located. Nothing else is presented in the statement. He doesn't participate in a record of interview. He's not taken into custody, but that statement is given to police.
It was not a confession.
No, very much so. It just says, I have knowledge of the location of the body. So it was carefully prepared by what would be his defence solicitor in subsequent proceedings. So there was no admissions. It was just, I have knowledge of where the location of her body is and detailed where she should be found. And I've got to say, without that statement, it's highly doubtful that the body would have been found because of where it had been buried. So what he'd done, and is certainly what the evidence that we presented to the court, was that he had committed the homicide, committed the assault on her, a violent assault in the house, and then had put her body, wrapped her into a blue tarpaulin, plastic tarpaulin, secured her hands and her feet and the blue tarpaulin with the grey duct tape that I'd found in the vehicle, and transported the body out of town to the banks of a river and dug a gravesite and buried her. Now, this particular area had been searched by the SES during very early days in just searching for the body, and it had been missed. And so I, receiving that notification, once again drove back from Tamworth to Tenterfield, arrived at the area indicated by Pryor and examined the scene, and he had done an incredible job at burying her and then covering the scene so that no one, even searching for her, would look at that area and say that's an obvious gravesite. It was quite amazing, even knowing that I was looking at the gravesite, that it wasn't obvious. And he'd replanted the tufts of long weeds and grass that he'd pulled out and covered it with branches and so forth. And so with that information, I then did an excavation of the gravesite and digging around the boundaries of the disturbed area. So we don't dig down into the disturbed area. You find the extremities and then dig down into that. and you expose the body in what's called a pedestal effect. So the body remains and you dig around it so as you can identify and find any evidence rather than digging down and potentially damaging or destroying other evidence. And in digging the scene, I found that there was first the bedclothes, all the bloodstained sheets and pillowcases and so forth, and then the body of Marlene wrapped in a blue tarpaulin, plastic tarpaulin, and secured with that duct tape. Also, I found in the bush, not too far away, were cable ties, which matched the same size and colour and everything as the cable ties found in his car. So here we're now getting further evidence linking evidence found in the car to evidence found at the scene of the burial, and of course the blood that's been found in these various locations. So her body was removed, and she would be conveyed to Sydney for a forensic post-mortem to determine death, cause of death, and the collection of the various items of forensic evidence.
I have a question as to why the ex-husband may have come forward with his statement. Were any of your findings, like the blood on the walls, anything like that, reported in the media?
Not that I know of. And the interesting thing was that when he came forward, because I'd certainly, at the end of my investigation of the scene, I was confident enough to advise Steve Clark, the detective who was in charge of the matter, that I thought there was enough grounds to arrest and charge. And so they were then out looking for this person because it was, I think it was close to a week in between the initial call and then the discovery of her body. And so, Steve, if it's not an understatement to say, he was very keen to find Raymond Pryor. And but the interesting thing whilst Pryor presented to the police station with that statement, he then pleaded not guilty at trial. And so went through committal, went to the Supreme Court, and I don't think it's an over-exaggeration to say that it was a forensic brief of evidence. There remained no witnesses. There was no admission. There was no CCTV footage. There was no mobile phones to be tracked to show locations and things like that. There wasn't the electronic evidence, which so often now forms part of the footprint left by offenders. There was none of that. It was a total forensic brief of evidence, and 3 days into the trial, where he was on trial before the Supreme Court for murder, he changed his plea and pleaded guilty.
Because that's interesting. If the forensic evidence was discredited, he could have offered no defence whatsoever.
He didn't have to offer anything, and if there was a collapse of the forensic evidence, well, the whole case fell apart. And it was all of these pieces of evidence, the duct tape that were found in the car. I was able to do a physical comparison of the end of the tape to the tape found around the body to show that it was one and the same. So the tape that was secured the tarpaulin, the plastic tarpaulin that was around her body, I was able to show to the court that the end of that tape matched the end of the roll that was found in his car. We had the blood there, the blood on his pants. It was a very strong forensic brief of evidence, which I think resulted in the change of plea so that he would benefit by the discount for a plea of guilty.
How were you cross-examined up until that point?
Well, and it might sound strange, but this is the disappointing thing, is I never got to give evidence. I was at the trial waiting to give evidence, and it was the change of plea was before I took to the witness box. And with the impaneling of the jury and the legal argument and setting of the closing, the opening addresses by defence and prosecution takes up that initial period of time. And before I got into the witness box, there was change of plea. And I say disappointing because I always enjoyed being tested by highly intelligent, experienced barristers, because I think it's one thing to put your opinions down on paper as to the very nature of the work that I'd undertaken, but until those theories and opinions are tested, they're just my opinions. And I always enjoyed giving evidence and being challenged on the work that we had done, and I felt like it was the job was never complete until you left the witness box.
When you saw the blood spots in the bedroom, did you have any theory as to how that body was removed? Because obviously there's no drag marks, no blood smears out of the floor. Bodies don't just vanish from a bed.
Yeah, I think it was pretty clear early on. Like as soon as I found the location and the amount of blood that was in there and then on the roof, it was clear that it had been a violent assault. And even before we found the cleanup, it was obvious that there had been a cleanup without having identified it. And again, I go back to the fact that the bed was made but without sheets. It was, for me, the obvious was that she was wrapped in the sheets that were on the bed, and she'd been taken from that room. And in the day that followed the first night at the scene, I think it was a Friday night, I remember searching the house and the caravan and the sheds, and in some strange way, I was opening each door, wondering if a body was behind it, and that he'd stacked the body there. And and each time I opened the door, it was kind of bracing myself: is a body going to fall out of here? And so the theory was that he rendered her sufficiently disabled and had wrapped her in the sheets, and then I would suggest put a blue tarpaulin on into the bedroom and taped her up and taped everything up and carried her out, put her into the car and drove her off to the gravesite.
Peter, this was so interesting, and the intensity of your job and the importance of your job and the absolute integrity with which you've done your job is impressive and a gold standard as far as I'm concerned. So thank you very, very much.
Oh, thanks, Kathy. Look, I always found it a deep privilege to do the work that I did, and thoroughly enjoyed our conversation today. So thanks for having me.
Crime Insiders Forensics is a LiSTNR original production. It's hosted by me, Kathryn Fox, and is produced by Ed Gooden. Sound design and imaging is by Link Kelly.